Wars are not always won by generals or guns, but by lonely minds listening carefully to patterns no one else believes are real. Tonight, imagine yourself sitting by a dying fire. The world outside is quiet, but not peaceful. Somewhere far away, ships are sinking in the dark. Cities sleep under the illusion of safety. And beneath it all, an invisible language is whispering instructions that decide who lives and who vanishes by morning. Most people never hear that language. History, as we are taught, is loud. It celebrates explosions, speeches, marches, and victories carved into stone. But the true pivots of civilization often occur in silence, in rooms that smell of damp paper and hot metal, in the minds of individuals whose names are spoken too late, or not at all. This is not a story about a machine. It is a story about how reality hides its truth behind noise, about how overwhelming complexity is often a disguise for a simple rule, patiently waiting to be noticed, and about how those who learn to separate signal from chaos gain a power so subtle that even empires fail to detect it until it is too late. The same law that shortened a world war by years still governs your life today. It moves through markets, through data, through opportunities missed by crowds, and quietly taken by a few. Most people drown in information. A small minority learns how to listen. If you are tired of shouting voices, empty promises, and fast answers that lead nowhere, then stay with me by this fire. We are going to slow down, we are going to listen, and we are going to trace the quiet path where intelligence becomes destiny. If this journey resonates with you, consider supporting the work by liking this video, subscribing to the Echoes of Wealth channel, or contributing so these stories can continue to be told. There is a particular kind of power that never announces itself, never demands attention, and never asks for permission, yet quietly rearranges the fate of the world while everyone else is distracted. In the winter of 1941, while newspapers screamed about battles and politicians argued over maps, a different war was unfolding in rooms with boarded windows and dim lamps. No flags, no medals, only paper, pencils, and the low mechanical breathing of machines that never slept. Every night, encrypted messages crossed Europe like ghost ships, carrying orders that would decide which convoys lived, which cities burned, and which families would never see each other again. To the outside world, these messages were meaningless noise, letters without sense, symbols without soul, but hidden inside them was a rhythm, a pulse, a structure that repeated itself with the stubbornness of human habit. Most people never notice patterns until someone explains them afterward. The men and women who gathered in silence understood something deeply unsettling. Wars are not won by strength alone. They are won by interpretation, by those who can look at chaos and ask a question no one else thinks to ask. Not, how do we break this? But what assumptions are holding this together? At the center of this quiet revolution stood a man who did not fit the world he was born into. Awkward, blunt, painfully honest, and almost offensively uninterested in social approval. While others saw the Enigma Machine as an impenetrable fortress of complexity, he saw something else entirely, a system built by humans, and therefore flawed by humans. What followed was not a miracle. It was something far more dangerous. It was the discovery that complexity is often camouflage, that overwhelming information can be a weapon designed to exhaust the mind, and that truth, when stripped of noise, is almost insultingly simple. This same mechanism is at work today. Markets flood you with data, opinions, charts, alerts, and urgency. Every voice claims authority. Every movement demands reaction. Most people respond the way they were trained to respond, emotionally, impulsively, late. They confuse motion with progress and information with insight, but a small number of individuals operate differently. They wait, they filter, they build quiet systems that listen instead of shout. They do not predict the future. They recognize repetition. They do not chase opportunity. They position themselves where opportunity is forced to reveal itself. This is not a story about genius as talent. It is a story about discipline of perception, about learning to subtract instead of add, about understanding that wealth, like victory, rarely comes from seeing more. It comes from seeing less, but seeing it clearly. Tonight, we are going to step into that silence. We are going to walk into the rooms where history bent without applause. We are going to sit beside minds that learned how to hear signals buried beneath oceans of noise. And we are going to extract the lesson that still applies to your money, your decisions, and your future. Because the war never ended, it only changed its disguise. And those who learn how to listen will always outlive those who only know how to react. Alan Turing was not born into history. He was born into misunderstanding. From the very beginning, the world around him felt slightly misaligned, as if the rules everyone else followed had been written in a language he was never taught to respect. As a child, he showed little interest in fitting in. Social rituals confused him. Small talk exhausted him. What captivated him instead were patterns, numbers, shapes, the quiet certainty that beneath the mess of appearances, something precise was always operating. Teachers often described him as brilliant and troublesome in the same breath. His handwriting was chaotic. His manners were blunt. He corrected authority without apology, not out of rebellion, but out of a near-innocent devotion to accuracy. If something was wrong, it had to be said. If a rule made no sense, it deserved no loyalty. This trait would follow him for life. In school, he found refuge in mathematics, not because it was abstract, but because it was honest. Numbers did not care who you were. Equations did not reward conformity. If the structure was correct, the result emerged whether society approved or not. Mathematics offered him a universe governed by inevitability rather than opinion. There was another wound that shaped him deeply, though it was rarely spoken of in polite history. As a young man, Turing experienced profound emotional attachment to a close friend, a bond that awakened both his sense of love and his sense of mortality. When that friend died suddenly, Turing was left staring into a question that would haunt him for decades. If the body could disappear so easily, what happened to thought, to memory, to pattern? He began to wonder whether the mind itself was a machine, not in a cold sense, but in a structural one. Could thought be reduced to steps? Could intelligence be understood as process rather than mystery? These questions were not idle philosophy, they were blueprints forming quietly in the background. When war arrived, it did not feel sudden to Turing, it felt inevitable. Europe descended into noise, speeches, marches, flags, promises. Newspapers shouted certainty, even as reality dissolved into confusion. Behind the scenes, however, another battlefield emerged, invisible to civilians and mostly ignored by generals, a battlefield made of symbols. Every day, German forces transmitted thousands of encrypted messages, orders for troop movements, naval coordinates, supply chains. Each message passed through a machine called Enigma, a device of rotating wheels and electrical pathways that transformed plain language into a storm of meaningless letters. To most observers, Enigma was unbreakable. Its complexity was staggering. Millions of possible settings, daily changes, no apparent pattern. Military leadership concluded that cracking it would require impossible luck or divine intervention. Turing saw something else. He understood that no matter how complex a system appeared, it was still designed by humans. And humans, for all their intelligence, shared predictable habits. They reused phrases, they avoided discomfort, they favored convenience over perfection, they believed their own assumptions were invisible. Complexity did not erase these flaws, it concealed them. When Turing arrived at Bletchley Park, the British code-breaking center, he stepped into a world that felt strangely familiar. The estate was cold, damp, and disorganized. The people were brilliant and socially unconventional. Linguists muttered to themselves. Chess players ignored rank. Mathematicians forgot meals and sleep. It was not a place of polish or ceremony. It was a place of raw cognition. Here, Turing did not need to explain his strangeness. It was currency. He quickly realized that the traditional approach to breaking Enigma was doomed. Trying to guess the correct settings by hand was like searching for a single grain of sand on an endless beach. The problem was not lack of intelligence, it was the wrong frame, so he reframed it. Instead of asking how to find the correct answer, Turing asked how to eliminate incorrect ones faster than any human ever could. This shift was subtle, almost trivial on the surface, but it changed everything. He did not need to know what the Germans were saying. He needed to know what they could not be saying. From this idea emerged the bomb. The bomb was not a thinking machine in the way people imagine today. It did not reason. It did not understand. It followed logic relentlessly without fatigue or emotion. It tested assumptions, discarded impossibilities, and moved on. Hour after hour, it narrowed chaos into structure. Night after night, the machines hummed. Paper fed through rollers. Lamps flickered in the dark. Slowly, something extraordinary happened. Messages that once looked random began to align. Patterns surfaced. Habits revealed themselves. The Germans, confident in their complexity, had left fingerprints everywhere. What followed was not triumph, but discipline. The information extracted from Enigma could not be used freely. Acting too precisely would reveal the secret. Entire convoys were allowed to be destroyed to preserve the illusion. Cities burned in silence. Victory required restraint more than aggression. Turing understood this cost. Power, when it is real, is almost never loud. The war turned, quietly, ships rerouted, submarines intercepted, lives saved without acknowledgement, and when the war finally ended, the world celebrated generals, not codebreakers. Turing returned to a society that no longer needed his mind and had little tolerance for his nature. But something irreversible had already happened. A new kind of intelligence had been born, one that did not chase answers, but filtered noise, one that understood complexity as camouflage, one that proved the future belonged not to those who shouted the loudest, but to those who listened longest. As the machines worked through the night, something subtle began to change inside the people who listened to them. Bletchley Park did not feel like a place winning a war. It felt like a monastery devoted to doubt. There were no speeches of certainty, no triumphal plans, only questions. Endless questions. What assumptions are hidden here? What is being repeated without awareness? What feels random, but is merely unobserved habit? Turing moved through this environment with a peculiar calm. He ran, long distances, alone, often chaining his mug to a radiator so it would not be taken. He ate erratically, he spoke plainly, sometimes painfully so. Yet when he worked, the room seemed to quiet around him, as if the chaos itself recognized authority. The Germans believed their strength lay in mathematics, in permutations so vast, they exceeded imagination. They believed that if something was too complex to compute, it was safe. This belief was their blind spot. Turing understood a deeper truth. Complexity does not defeat intelligence, it exhausts it. The Enigma operators, pressed by time and routine, relied on predictable openings, weather reports, standard greetings, familiar phrases that made their work easier. These small human comforts were invisible to them, but obvious to someone looking for repetition rather than novelty. This was the core insight. Patterns do not announce themselves. They hide inside boredom. Turing called these predictable fragments cribs, not because they were childish, but because they were foundational. Like the wooden slats beneath a mattress, they supported the entire structure of secrecy. Once you found a crib, the machine could do the rest. This is where the war against noise truly began. Each intercepted message arrived as a blur of letters, stripped of meaning, but Turing did not try to read them. He aligned them. He compared structures. He asked what must be true for this message to exist at all. The Bombay did not solve language. It solved constraints. Every time a possibility was eliminated, the world grew slightly quieter. Days blurred into nights, nights into weeks. The work was relentless, but not dramatic. There were no moments of revelation that felt cinematic. Progress arrived in inches, not leaps, but those inches accumulated into something terrifyingly powerful. One morning, a pattern held. A convoy appeared on the map before it had been announced. A submarine route emerged from the darkness. For the first time, intelligence did not chase events. It anticipated them. The Allies were no longer reacting to the war. They were listening to it. This created a new kind of tension. Knowing something and using it are not the same act. If the British Navy avoided every ambush perfectly, the Germans would know their codes were broken. If every intercepted plan failed, the illusion of security would collapse. And once the illusion collapsed, the war would return to chaos. So they chose silence. Ships were sacrificed, men died, mothers received letters that did not explain why fate had been allowed to take their sons. Power demanded moral restraint. Victory required patience that bordered on cruelty. Turing accepted this without complaint. He was not sentimental about outcomes. He understood systems, and he understood that systems survive only when their internal rules are respected. After the war, this way of thinking followed him into new territory. Turing turned his attention to machines not as tools, but as processes. He asked whether intelligence itself could be formalized. Could a machine learn? Could it adapt? Could it mistake noise for signal the way humans did? These questions were not welcomed. The world wanted heroes and normalcy, not ambiguity. Turing's ideas felt unsettling, even threatening. A future where machines mirrored thought raised uncomfortable questions about what it meant to be human. At the same time, his personal life placed him at odds with the society he had saved. His honesty, once useful in logic, became dangerous in a culture built on concealment. When he was prosecuted for his private life, the punishment was not only legal, it was symbolic. The same civilization that benefited from his clarity rejected him for it. Yet even here, the pattern held. Systems consume what they cannot understand. They exploit what they need, then discard the remainder. This is not cruelty, it is structure. Turing's later work, dismissed or ignored during his life, quietly became the foundation of everything that followed: computing, artificial intelligence, data analysis, pattern recognition. Entire industries built themselves on principles he articulated while sitting in drafty rooms during wartime. And this is where the lesson turns toward you. Markets, like Enigma, overwhelm participants with information. Prices move, news breaks, opinions multiply, complexity grows until it feels safer to surrender judgment and follow the crowd. Most people do exactly that. They confuse volume with truth. But the edge does not belong to those who know more. It belongs to those who eliminate more. The investor who survives is not the one chasing insight, but the one filtering distraction, the one who understands that human behavior repeats under pressure, that fear creates habits, that greed writes predictable scripts. Turing never predicted the future, he reduced it. And in doing so, he revealed a law that still governs every arena of power. When you cannot compute everything, you must choose what not to compute at all. There is a moment in every great system where success becomes more dangerous than failure. For Turing and the small circle at Bletchley Park, that moment arrived not with celebration, but with fear. The more clearly they could read the enemy's intentions, the heavier the burden became. Knowledge once acquired demanded judgment, and judgment, when exercised poorly, could erase the advantage entirely. They were no longer decoding messages, they were managing reality. Every decrypted transmission presented a dilemma. If acted upon too precisely, it risked exposing the fact that Enigma was compromised. If ignored, it meant allowing destruction that could have been prevented. This tension reshaped the psychology of everyone involved. The work ceased to feel intellectual and became existential. Turing rarely spoke about these decisions, but those who worked near him noticed a change. He grew quieter, more withdrawn. His runs became longer, his silences heavier. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that intelligence without discipline is self-defeating. A system that reveals too much collapses itself. This principle, though born in war, is universal. Most people believe the purpose of knowledge is action, but Turing lived inside a more uncomfortable truth. The purpose of knowledge is optionality. It gives you the ability to choose, not the obligation to act. Acting too often, too visibly, converts advantage into vulnerability. This restraint defined the remainder of the war. Intelligence was rationed, success was masked, losses were permitted to preserve the long game. The Allies did not win because they knew everything. They won because they controlled what knowing meant. When the war ended, this way of thinking had no place in public life. The world demanded stories with heroes and villains, with visible sacrifice and reward. It wanted clarity, not ambiguity. Turing returned to civilian life, carrying insights that no longer fit the narrative. He was celebrated briefly, then forgotten deliberately, but his mind did not slow down. He began to formalize what he had practiced intuitively during the war. He asked whether any process of thought could be expressed as a sequence of steps, whether intelligence itself could be abstracted from biology, whether the act of reasoning was simply the systematic elimination of impossibilities. This was not science fiction to him, it was an extension of wartime necessity. He imagined a machine that could simulate any other machine, given the correct instructions, a universal system, flexible, abstract, detached from any single task. In doing so, he laid the foundation for modern computing, though few recognized it at the time. The tragedy is not that Turing was misunderstood, it is that he was understood just enough to be useful and not enough to be protected. His prosecution for his private life was framed as morality, but it functioned as something else entirely, a system correcting deviation. The same society that had depended on his difference could not tolerate it. Once the emergency ended, he was chemically altered, isolated, humiliated. Yet even here, the pattern remained intact. Systems punish visibility more harshly than deviation. What cannot be hidden becomes dangerous. Turing's death, officially ruled a suicide, remains surrounded by ambiguity. Some believe it was despair, others whisper about accidents or quiet coercion. The truth may never be known. What is known is this: the man who taught the world how to think like a machine was discarded once the machine had been built. And yet, his ideas survived him effortlessly, because ideas, once abstracted properly, do not require their creators. Today, every algorithm that filters data, every model that reduces noise, every system that prioritizes probability over narrative traces its lineage back to those quiet nights at Bletchley Park. Markets now operate at speeds no human can match. Information flows without pause. Complexity has multiplied beyond comprehension. And still, the same human habits persist: fear, greed, routine, repetition. The modern investor faces a problem identical in structure to Enigma: too many signals, too much urgency, too much false complexity. The temptation is to react faster, consume more data, and follow louder voices. This is precisely what destroys edge. The discipline Turing embodied points elsewhere. Reduce the problem, identify constraints, look for repetition under pressure, eliminate impossibilities, build systems that act without emotion, and above all, learn when not to act. The most dangerous moment in any market is not ignorance, it is partial clarity combined with impatience. Turing did not survive to see the world shaped by his thinking, but the law he uncovered continues to operate without regard for recognition. Those who learn to manage noise inherit leverage. Those who chase every signal exhaust themselves. The war taught him this lesson brutally. The market teaches it quietly. After the war, the silence did not lift, it simply changed shape. Turing returned to a country eager to forget the cost of its survival. Bletchley Park was dismantled, documents were sealed, machines were broken apart or locked away. The world moved on, loudly and quickly, while the architects of its quiet victory faded into obscurity. For Turing, this erasure was not merely political, it was personal. He took up work at the National Physical Laboratory, where he attempted to build what would become one of the earliest stored program computers. Once again, he found himself ahead of both technology and imagination. Funding was slow, bureaucracy was heavy, his ideas, too abstract, too unorthodox, met polite resistance. He had already lived inside the future, the present felt clumsy. During this time, Turing turned his attention to questions that bridged logic and biology. He studied how patterns emerged in nature, why stripes appear on animals, why order arises spontaneously from chaos. These were not digressions. They were continuations of the same obsession: pattern under pressure, structure beneath randomness. He believed intelligence was not magic, it was emergence. Yet, as his intellectual legacy grew, his personal life became increasingly dangerous. His honesty, once useful in mathematical proof, proved fatal in social reality. When he was reported for his relationship with another man, the machinery of the state moved quickly and without mercy. He was given a choice that was not a choice: prison or chemical treatment. He chose the latter, believing it would allow him to continue working. The consequences were devastating. His body changed, his energy declined, his clarity dimmed. This was the final irony. The man who had helped humanity learn how to think more clearly was punished for existing honestly. Despite this, Turing continued to work. He continued to think. He continued to believe that understanding structure mattered more than approval. But the isolation deepened. The world he had helped save had no room for him. When he died, the news passed quietly. Only later did recognition arrive. Statues, apologies, posthumous honors. They came too late to matter, but they confirmed something important. Systems correct themselves eventually. They just do not apologize in time. This arc, painful as it is, carries a lesson that extends far beyond history. In every domain where pattern recognition creates power, visibility becomes a liability. The more clearly you see, the more carefully you must choose when to be seen. This applies to intelligence, innovation, and wealth alike. Most people believe success looks like validation, recognition, applause. But Turing's life demonstrates a harsher truth. Durable advantage prefers anonymity. Systems that work best do not draw attention to themselves. In finance, this principle is violated constantly. Investors announce strategies. Funds market brilliance. Influencers broadcast every trade. And in doing so, they invite competition, erosion, and eventual collapse. The edge that is talked about is already decaying. The discipline is to remain unremarkable, build processes that function quietly, allow compounding to operate without interruption, accept periods of misunderstanding, accept being early, accept being invisible. Turing's greatest contribution was not the machines he designed, but the mental posture he embodied. He trusted structure over story. He valued elimination over prediction. He respected silence more than spectacle. The world now runs on systems shaped by these values, even as it rewards those who appear to violate them. And this contradiction is where most people lose their footing. They chase visibility in a world that rewards discretion. They seek complexity in environments governed by repetition. They consume noise in systems that punish distraction. Turing never offered a philosophy of wealth. He never wrote about markets, but the law he uncovered remains intact. Where complexity overwhelms the crowd, filtration creates power. Where emotion dominates action, structure creates survival. His life is not a blueprint to imitate, it is a warning to understand. See clearly, act selectively, remain quiet. That is how wars are shortened. That is how systems endure. That is how advantage compounds. There is a final illusion that must be dismantled, and it is the most seductive of all. The illusion that intelligence guarantees reward. Turing's life disproves this with brutal elegance. He was indispensable when the system required clarity. He was disposable when it required conformity. This is not a moral judgment, it is an architectural one. Systems do not preserve truth, they preserve stability. Once Enigma was broken, once the war was won, the structure that needed Turing dissolved, and without that structure, his difference became a liability instead of an asset. This is not unique to history. It repeats everywhere power and complexity intersect. Markets behave the same way. During moments of crisis, pattern seers are tolerated, sometimes even celebrated. When chaos reigns, those who can filter noise become valuable. But once stability returns, the system no longer rewards deviation. It rewards reassurance, familiar narratives, comfortable lies. This is why most fortunes are not made during obvious opportunities, but during uncomfortable ones. The work Turing did was not heroic in the conventional sense. It was tedious, repetitive, mentally exhausting. He stared at structures long after others lost patience. He trusted process over inspiration, and most importantly, he accepted that meaning emerges slowly, not dramatically. This temperament is rare. Most people want answers quickly. They want certainty packaged as confidence. They want complexity explained without effort, but systems that generate real leverage do not respond to impatience. They respond to endurance. Turing's machines did not produce instant clarity, they produced gradual reduction. Noise thinned, possibilities narrowed, certainty approached asymptotically, never fully arriving, only becoming usable. This is how compounding works. Wealth does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly while attention is elsewhere. It rewards those who resist the urge to interfere, those who build systems that operate without supervision, those who understand that doing less, consistently, often produces more than doing more, erratically. Turing understood this instinctively. His machines worked because they were not interrupted by emotion. They did not panic. They did not celebrate. They simply continued. Human beings struggle with this. In markets, people sabotage their own systems constantly. They override rules after a loss. They chase validation after a win. They mistake activity for intelligence. In doing so, they reintroduce noise into processes designed to eliminate it. The lesson is uncomfortable, but unavoidable. If your system requires you to feel good in order to function, it is not a system, it is a story. The bomb worked because it did not care whether its operators believed in it on a given day. It did not need confidence, it needed consistency. The moment it was switched on, it began doing exactly what it was designed to do, without commentary or hesitation. This is the mentality that endures. Not genius, not brilliance, not speed, but structural alignment between intention and execution. Turing's legacy lives here, not in mythology, but in architecture, in every process that filters chaos, in every model that prioritizes probability over prediction, in every discipline that values silence over spectacle. His life warns us against expecting fairness. His work instructs us in building durability. The world will not reward you for seeing clearly. It will only reward you if you structure your life so that clarity compounds quietly without needing permission. This is the final pattern. Noise grows louder as systems age, complexity increases as camouflage, truth becomes simpler, harder to see, and easier to ignore. Those who learn to subtract rather than accumulate will always appear slow at first, and then, suddenly, they are far ahead. Turing never chased recognition, he chased coherence. And coherence, once achieved, does not need applause to operate. It simply works. The Enigma Machine did not terrify its enemies because it was cruel, it terrified them because it was elegant. At first glance, Enigma looked harmless. A polished wooden box, a keyboard like a typewriter, lamps that glowed softly when pressed. It did not resemble a weapon, it resembled an office tool, something civil, something almost polite, and that was part of its deception. Inside, however, it was a cathedral of misdirection. Each keystroke sent an electrical current through a series of rotating wheels. Every wheel altered the signal slightly. With every letter typed, the internal state of the machine changed, meaning the same letter would never encrypt to the same symbol twice in a row. Add to this a plug board that swapped letters before and after the rotors, and you had a system whose number of possible daily configurations exceeded the number of seconds since the beginning of time. To the German High Command, this complexity felt like certainty. They believed Enigma was secure, not because it had been tested, but because it felt overwhelming. No human could hold all its possibilities in their head. No ordinary calculation could exhaust its combinations. And so, they trusted it, the way people trust things they do not understand, blindly, comfortably. This is the first illusion of complexity. When something becomes too intricate to imagine, the mind mistakes exhaustion for proof. The German cryptographers did not ask whether Enigma could be broken, they asked how long it would take, and when the answer exceeded reasonable limits, they stopped thinking. Security, in their minds, was a function of scale. Bigger meant safer, more complicated meant invulnerable. They never questioned whether complexity itself could become a weakness, because Enigma's strength depended on something fragile, human procedure. Every morning, operators set the machine according to a daily key. They aligned rotors, connected plugs, followed instructions, and then they sent messages under pressure, fatigue, fear, and habit. They were not philosophers, they were soldiers, and soldiers value speed and routine over theoretical perfection. This is where the machine betrayed them. Enigma was not broken because it was weak, it was broken because it was used by humans. The Germans repeated phrases. They avoided awkward letter combinations. They began messages with predictable formats. They signed off with familiar closings. Weather reports were sent daily. Status updates followed ritual. The machine transformed letters, but it could not transform behavior. The illusion of randomness concealed a deeper regularity. This is the nature of camouflage. True camouflage does not hide by absence. It hides by excess, by flooding perception until discernment collapses. The Enigma machine did not eliminate patterns, it buried them, and buried patterns are often more stable than visible ones. Those at Bletchley Park understood this intuitively. They did not marvel at Enigma's complexity. They dismissed it, not out of arrogance, but out of clarity. They knew that no system built for daily use could maintain perfect randomness. Friction would creep in, shortcuts would be taken, habits would calcify. Complexity demands energy. Humans conserve energy. This is not a moral flaw, it is biological law. Wherever complexity increases, reliance on routine follows. Wherever reliance on routine follows, predictability emerges. And wherever predictability emerges, systems can be penetrated by those patient enough to observe. This law does not belong to war. It belongs to reality. Every large organization hides behind complexity. Bureaucracy multiplies. Language becomes technical. Processes grow opaque. The stated purpose is efficiency or security, but the real effect is exhaustion. Those inside stop questioning. Those outside stop trying. Complexity becomes a shield not against intelligence, but against attention. The Enigma machine was a perfect embodiment of this dynamic. It did not defeat its enemies by being unbreakable. It defeated them by convincing them not to look. Until someone did. And when they did, the collapse was not dramatic. It was quiet, incremental, almost boring. One assumption discarded, one pattern isolated, one constraint exploited. The machine did not shatter. It simply yielded. This is the philosophical pivot. Truth rarely announces itself with clarity. It waits beneath layers of distraction, and those layers are often deliberately constructed, not to protect truth, but to protect belief. Belief that the system works. Belief that effort equals safety. Belief that complexity equals intelligence. But reality is indifferent to belief. Reality responds to structure. In markets, the same illusion dominates. Financial systems grow increasingly complex, derivatives stacked on derivatives, models layered upon models, indicators multiplied until charts resemble abstract art. The promise is protection, sophistication, precision. The result is paralysis. Most participants do not understand the systems they rely on. They trust them because they look advanced, because they feel rigorous, because someone authoritative says they are. And just like Enigma, these systems depend on human behavior to function. Traders repeat mistakes, funds follow incentives, institutions protect narratives, fear and greed override logic in predictable cycles. Complexity does not eliminate this, it amplifies it by hiding it. The disciplined observer does not need to decode everything. They need to identify where effort gives way to habit, where stress reveals repetition, where systems pretend to be random but cannot escape human nature. This is where signal lives. Not in headlines, not in speed, not in volume, but in structure. The Enigma machine fell because someone understood that complexity is not the opposite of simplicity, it is often its disguise. And markets, like machines, eventually reveal their shortcuts. Once you understand that complexity hides rather than protects, a second, more unsettling truth emerges. Those who build complex systems rarely intend to deceive others. More often, they are deceiving themselves. The architects of Enigma were not villains in lab coats plotting misdirection. They were engineers solving a practical problem. How do we communicate securely under pressure? How do we prevent interception without slowing operations? Each added layer of complexity felt responsible, professional, even elegant. But elegance can become vanity. Every additional rotor, every plugboard permutation, every procedural rule created a sense of intellectual superiority. The machine began to feel invincible, not because it had been proven so, but because no one could imagine its failure. This is the psychological trap of sophistication. When a system becomes too intricate to question, it stops being tested. Testing requires humility. The German cryptographic command trusted Enigma because it reflected their own self-image. Orderly, precise, advanced. It was a mechanical expression of their belief in rational dominance. To doubt Enigma would be to doubt themselves. This is how systems rot quietly. At Bletchley Park, the approach was inverted. The goal was not to admire the machine, but to disrespect it, to assume it was wrong, to assume shortcuts existed, to assume that humans, when faced with pressure, will always choose convenience over optimality. This posture is rare. Most people want systems to work. Very few want to prove that they don't. The codebreakers listened not for brilliance, but for laziness. They searched for the moments where discipline cracked, where procedure bent, where exhaustion replaced rigor. These moments were invisible to those who believed in the system. They were obvious to those who distrusted it. Every system leaks where it touches reality. Enigma leaked at the human interface. The operator who reused a phrase because it felt familiar. The officer who avoided rare letter combinations because they looked suspicious. The clerk who sent weather reports at the same time every morning. These were not mistakes, they were adaptations. Humans adapt to complexity by simplifying behavior. They create rituals to survive cognitive load, and rituals by definition repeat. This is the philosophical hinge. Randomness is expensive, structure is cheap. True randomness requires constant energy, vigilance, and discipline. Structure emerges naturally when energy is conserved. Under stress, structure dominates. Habits form, patterns stabilize. This is why chaos, paradoxically, becomes more predictable over time. The longer a system operates under pressure, the more its hidden rules reveal themselves. The more it claims to be dynamic, the more rigid it becomes internally. This is not unique to cryptography. Organizations behave this way, markets behave this way, entire civilizations behave this way. At first, innovation creates complexity, new rules, new instruments, new layers. Over time, the cost of maintaining that complexity increases. People stop understanding the whole, they specialize, they automate, they rely on precedent. Eventually, no one knows why things are done a certain way, they only know that changing it feels dangerous. This is when camouflage becomes vulnerability, because camouflage works only when no one looks closely. The Enigma machine collapsed not because it was flawed, but because someone finally looked without reverence, without fear, without awe. This required a particular temperament, one that resists intimidation by scale, one that is not seduced by appearances, one that understands that the most dangerous systems are the ones no one dares to question. This temperament translates directly into financial survival. Modern markets are vast machines of complexity. Products are nested inside products. Risk is displaced, renamed, and redistributed until it feels abstract. Language becomes technical, responsibility becomes diffuse, and participants assume that if something is this complex, it must be safe. This is the same illusion. Financial crises do not emerge from simplicity, they emerge from misunderstood sophistication, from systems no one fully comprehends, but everyone relies on. When stress arrives, these systems reveal their habits. Forced selling, liquidity freezes, correlations spike. Suddenly, what looked diversified behaves like a single organism. The disciplined observer does not wait for crisis to learn this. They study how systems behave when unobserved. They watch what repeats. They note what happens when incentives align too cleanly. They ask which behaviors are rewarded and which are merely tolerated. They assume that complexity will eventually collapse inward. This does not require cynicism, it requires realism. The Enigma Machine was defeated because someone respected reality more than reputation, because they trusted structure over story, because they understood that complexity is often an admission of uncertainty disguised as confidence. In finance, this insight is uncomfortable because it demands restraint. It asks you to ignore impressive language, to distrust excessive precision, to step back from models that explain everything except failure. It asks you to look for the places where humans intervene, simplify, and repeat. This is where risk concentrates. This is where opportunity hides. The crowd is hypnotized by sophistication. The disciplined mind searches for shortcuts. Enigma taught this lesson at the cost of millions of lives. Markets teach it more quietly, but they teach it just as relentlessly. There is a final stage in every complex system, and it is the stage no one prepares for. It is the moment when the system begins to believe its own myth. By the later years of the war, Enigma was no longer just a machine. It was an article of faith. German command did not merely use it, they trusted it. That trust changed behavior in subtle but fatal ways. Messages became bolder, assumptions grew lazier, operational confidence increased precisely when caution was most needed. This is the paradox of security. The stronger a shield appears, the more recklessly people behave behind it. When you believe something cannot fail, you stop asking how it might. At Bletchley Park, this shift was noticed immediately. As German confidence increased, so did their predictability. Messages grew longer, procedures became rigid. The very belief in Enigma's invincibility accelerated its collapse. This is not irony, it is structure. Belief alters behavior, behavior creates patterns, patterns expose systems. The machine did not change, the humans did. This is the moment where myth becomes philosophy. Human beings do not respond to reality as it is. They respond to the story they tell themselves about reality, and once that story solidifies, behavior follows it faithfully, even when the story is wrong. The German cryptographic command believed complexity equaled safety. That belief shaped every decision downstream. It justified complacency. It discouraged skepticism. It transformed engineers into guardians of doctrine rather than investigators of truth. In contrast, the Allied codebreakers lived without myth. They assumed failure was always possible. They trusted nothing implicitly. Their power did not come from confidence, but from suspicion. This difference in mental posture decided the outcome. One side worshipped complexity, the other dissected it. This distinction appears everywhere power concentrates. In finance, the most dangerous moment is not when markets are volatile, it is when they are calm, when models appear stable, when risk feels quantified, when past performance is mistaken for structural truth. This is when belief hardens. Investors begin to assume certain assets are safe, certain correlations permanent, certain strategies timeless. Complexity reinforces this illusion by making systems feel scientific, precise, objective, beyond doubt. But complexity does not remove human incentives, it obscures them. Traders still seek bonuses, funds still chase inflows, institutions still protect reputations. When pressure arrives, these incentives assert themselves with mechanical predictability. Selling becomes synchronized, liquidity evaporates, models converge on the same failure, just like Enigma. The lesson is not to reject complexity outright, it is to understand its life cycle. Complexity begins as innovation, it becomes camouflage, it ends as dogma. Those who profit consistently position themselves before the final stage. They exit systems that no longer tolerate questioning. They reduce exposure when belief replaces testing. They simplify when others add layers. This requires a willingness to look wrong early. The codebreakers at Bletchley often felt foolish. While the world admired Enigma, they worked in obscurity, doubting assumptions that everyone else accepted. Their reward came later, quietly, when the system collapsed under its own confidence. Markets reward the same posture. Those who simplify too soon look unsophisticated. Those who question too early look paranoid. Those who step away before consensus peaks look cowardly. Until they don't. The final collapse of Enigma was not dramatic. There was no moment when the machine stopped working. There was no announcement of failure. It continued encrypting messages until the very end. The Germans never fully accepted that it had been compromised. This is another uncomfortable truth. Systems rarely announce their defeat. They function, they operate, they appear intact, and yet their outputs are already being anticipated, neutralized, and rendered harmless by those who understand their structure. By the time failure becomes visible, the advantage has long been transferred. In finance, this is why the public recognizes bubbles only after they burst, why narratives shift only after losses crystallize, why explanations always arrive too late to matter. The disciplined observer does not wait for confirmation. They study belief itself. When everyone agrees something is safe, they ask why. When complexity is praised, they ask who benefits. When explanations multiply, they ask what is being avoided. They understand that truth does not need excessive defense. The Enigma machine fell not because it was weak, but because belief made it rigid, and rigidity, under pressure, always breaks first. This is the final translation from myth to philosophy to finance. Do not fear complexity, but never worship it. Respect systems, but never trust them blindly. And remember that the most dangerous signal in any environment is unanimous confidence. Long before the world whispered the name Bletchley Park, long before British intelligence claimed the quiet victory of insight, the first fracture in Enigma appeared elsewhere, not in a grand capital, not in a well-funded laboratory, but in a nation that history had already begun to erase. Poland, in the years between two disasters, lived with a constant awareness of its own vulnerability. Sandwiched between powers that spoke in threats and mobilized in silence, it understood something instinctively. Survival did not belong to the strongest, it belonged to the earliest. This awareness shaped a small group of minds inside the Polish Cipher Bureau. Unlike their German counterparts, they did not worship Enigma's complexity, they feared it, and fear, when paired with discipline, sharpens perception. Among them was a young mathematician whose disposition mirrored Turing's in uncanny ways. Quiet, precise, unimpressed by authority. He did not approach Enigma as a linguistic puzzle, but as a mathematical object. Letters did not interest him. Structure did. This distinction mattered. Most early attempts to break Enigma failed because they treated language as the primary terrain. They searched for words, phrases, meaning. But Enigma did not scramble meaning. It scrambled relationships. It transformed one symbol into another through deterministic processes. And deterministic processes, no matter how layered, leave fingerprints. The Polish team understood this earlier than anyone else. Instead of asking what messages said, they asked how the machine behaved, how rotors permuted inputs, how electrical pathways constrained outputs. They reduced Enigma to a set of mathematical transformations and began to reverse engineer its internal logic. This was not glamorous work. It required months of staring at abstract symbols without narrative payoff. It demanded a temperament comfortable with uncertainty. Progress arrived slowly, without reassurance. But it arrived. By the early 1930s, the Polish cryptanalysts had reconstructed the wiring of Enigma's rotors. They built their own mechanical devices to exploit this knowledge. They discovered that what appeared infinite was, in fact, bounded. That complexity, when mapped, reveals edges. This was the first truth Enigma could not hide. Yet history rarely rewards those who see first. Poland lacked the industrial capacity to scale this insight. As Germany grew more aggressive, resources dwindled, time collapsed, and when invasion became inevitable, the Polish team made a decision that altered the course of the war. They shared everything. Not cautiously, not partially, completely. Rotor wirings, methods, machines. Years of work handed over to British and French intelligence in a matter of days. Knowledge transferred under the shadow of annihilation. This act is often understated in popular history, but it carries profound meaning. Those who understand systems earliest rarely profit from them longest. Early insight often arrives in environments that cannot capitalize on it. The advantage migrates to those who inherit structure, not those who discover it. This is not injustice, it is architecture. The British did not begin from nothing, they began from Poland's shoulders. Turing's work, monumental as it was, stood on a foundation laid quietly by people whose country would soon vanish from maps. This pattern repeats relentlessly. In finance, early signals often appear in fragile places, in marginal markets, in obscure data, in environments dismissed as irrelevant. Those closest to stress notice fractures first. Those insulated by comfort notice last. The Polish Cipher Bureau saw Enigma clearly because they had no illusion of safety. They did not believe in invincibility. They expected failure. That expectation sharpened their attention. This is the philosophical pivot. Complacency dulls perception. Precarity refines it. When survival depends on clarity, myths collapse quickly. When comfort prevails, myths calcify. The German command believed in Enigma because it fit their narrative of dominance. The Polish analysts questioned it because their lives depended on skepticism. Markets follow the same rule. Those with the most to lose often see risk earliest. Those with the most power often deny it longest. Early warnings are dismissed as noise because they originate from places deemed insignificant. By the time the warning reaches the center, it has been softened, delayed, or ignored entirely. The Enigma story exposes this uncomfortable truth. The first crack in the machine did not come from brilliance alone. It came from necessity, from minds that could not afford belief, from analysts who knew that assuming safety was itself a form of surrender. This is why the myth of genius is misleading. Breakthroughs are not born from confidence, they are born from pressure. The Polish cryptanalysts did not imagine themselves as heroes. They saw a threat and responded with rigor. Their reward was not survival, but transmission. Their legacy lived on in others. And this, too, is a financial lesson. Alpha rarely belongs to those who see first. It belongs to those who recognize early insight, scale it, and protect it long enough for it to matter. Many discover patterns. Few have the structure to exploit them. Understanding this prevents bitterness. It redirects focus. Do not seek to be first. Seek to be prepared. The machine began to crack, not when it was attacked by empires, but when it was quietly mapped by those who could not afford illusion. What the Polish cryptanalysts understood, perhaps without fully naming it, was that timing is a form of intelligence. They did not wait for permission to question Enigma. They did not wait for institutional certainty. They worked under the assumption that delay itself was a liability. Every day spent admiring the machine was a day surrendered to it. And so they moved with a quiet urgency that came not from panic, but from clarity. This urgency shaped their method. They treated Enigma not as a mystery to be admired, but as an object to be dismantled. They refused to be impressed. They assumed that if something existed, it could be described. If it could be described, it could be modeled. And if it could be modeled, it could be manipulated. This mindset is the opposite of reverence. Reverence freezes inquiry. It replaces investigation with awe. The Polish team had no luxury for awe. They lived under the shadow of invasion. Their skepticism was not intellectual fashion. It was survival instinct. As they reconstructed Enigma's internal logic, they discovered something deeply humbling. The machine's apparent randomness was an illusion created by rotation, not by true unpredictability. Every transformation followed a rule. Every rule repeated. The machine did not improvise, it obeyed. This realization changes how one sees the world. Once you internalize that systems obey rules, even when they appear chaotic, fear loses its grip. Chaos becomes a puzzle rather than a threat, and puzzles invite patience. The Polish breakthrough did not come with celebration, it came with responsibility. They knew what they had found, and they knew what they lacked: resources, scale, time. When Germany invaded, there was no illusion left to protect, only knowledge to preserve. So they made a decision that runs counter to most human instinct. They gave away their advantage. They did not hoard it, they did not monetize it, they did not wrap it in pride. They transferred it fully, knowing they might never benefit from it themselves. This act was not altruism in the sentimental sense. It was strategic realism. Knowledge unused is knowledge wasted. They understood that insight without infrastructure is fragile, that brilliance without scale dies quietly, that survival sometimes requires surrendering ownership. This is a lesson few accept willingly. In finance, early discovery often arrives before readiness. Patterns emerge before capital exists to exploit them. Insights surface before emotional discipline is developed to act on them. Many see something true too early and lose faith when the world does not respond. They abandon the insight, assuming it was wrong. The Polish cryptanalysts did not make this mistake. They understood that being early feels identical to being mistaken. The difference is endurance. They did not need validation, they needed continuity. By passing their work to others, they ensured that the pattern would outlive them. This transfer of insight is how power actually moves. Rarely does the originator of an idea become its primary beneficiary. More often, advantage accrues to those who inherit knowledge at the moment they can act on it. This does not diminish the origin, it explains the flow. The British codebreakers received more than information. They received years of compressed time. The Polish work eliminated entire categories of ignorance. It allowed Turing and his colleagues to skip dead ends, to focus on scaling rather than discovery. This is why later history feels uneven. It celebrates the visible victory and forgets the invisible preparation. But the structure is consistent. In markets, breakthroughs rarely arrive fully formed. They emerge in fragments, in anomalies, in uncomfortable data points that do not yet fit a narrative. Those who benefit most are not always those who notice first, but those who recognize early insight and protect it long enough for conditions to align. This requires humility. It requires admitting that discovery and exploitation are separate skills, that seeing clearly does not guarantee acting effectively, that sometimes the most intelligent move is to hand insight to a structure capable of carrying it further. The Polish cryptanalysts were not defeated by Enigma, they were overtaken by history, yet their work became the seed from which the entire Allied cryptographic effort grew. They cracked the machine not by force, but by orientation. They asked different questions, because they lived under different constraints. Their clarity was born of necessity, not genius. This is the deeper lesson. Pressure refines perception, comfort dulls it. Those closest to danger often see reality first. Those farthest from it often deny it longest. If you want to understand where future fractures will appear, do not look to centers of power. Look to edges. Look to margins. Look to those who cannot afford belief. This is where systems reveal themselves. When the knowledge left Poland, it did not travel as triumph. It traveled as a warning. Boxes crossed borders, papers were memorized, then destroyed, machines were disassembled, their logic carried not in metal, but in minds. By the time the German advance erased offices and archives, the essence of Enigma had already escaped. What could not be protected by walls was protected by understanding. This is how fragile truths survive. The British did not inherit certainty, they inherited incompleteness. The Polish work revealed structure, not victory. It showed where Enigma could be touched, not how to finish the task. What arrived in Britain was not an answer, but a direction, and direction, when paired with scale, becomes destiny. At Bletchley Park, this inheritance changed everything. The machine was no longer an object of awe, it became a map with missing roads. Turing and his colleagues did not need to believe Enigma could be broken. They knew it could. The question shifted from possibility to efficiency. This shift matters more than it appears. When a system is believed unbreakable, effort is timid. When it is known to be breakable, effort becomes ruthless. Every assumption is challenged. Every shortcut is hunted. Work accelerates because doubt has been replaced by intent. The Polish contribution did not solve the war. It solved disbelief. And disbelief is often the most expensive obstacle. In markets, the same barrier appears again and again. Certain assets are assumed untouchable, certain narratives assumed permanent, certain risks assumed theoretical. These assumptions do not survive scrutiny, but scrutiny rarely arrives without provocation. Cracks appear first, where stress concentrates. The Polish analysts saw Enigma clearly because their nation lived under constant threat. Their perception was sharpened by necessity. They did not ask whether the machine might be breakable in theory. They asked how soon it had to be. This urgency is not panic, it is focus. Urgency forces prioritization. It strips away decoration. It demands progress over elegance. It compels minds to abandon reverence and pursue utility. Under pressure, truth becomes practical. This is why early warnings almost always come from the periphery. The edges feel pressure first. They feel imbalance before the center does. They notice friction, while others enjoy momentum. And because they lack comfort, they lack illusion. The center, by contrast, is insulated by belief. It mistakes stability for permanence. It confuses scale with safety. It assumes tomorrow will resemble yesterday because yesterday rewarded that assumption. The Enigma machine thrived on this asymmetry. Its complexity reassured the center. Its rigidity exposed it to the edges. By the time German command realized something was wrong, it was already too late to ask meaningful questions. The machine still worked, messages still flowed, nothing appeared broken. The failure was invisible because it had become systemic. This is the most dangerous kind of failure, the kind that does not announce itself. Markets collapse this way, not with alarms, but with silence. Liquidity dries up quietly, correlations converge silently, models continue producing outputs, even as their assumptions rot beneath them. Those who wait for confirmation are always late. The Polish cryptanalysts did not wait. They acted under uncertainty. They passed on insight before proof felt complete. They understood that partial clarity used early outweighs perfect clarity used too late. This is a principle that rewards courage over certainty. In finance, waiting for total understanding is a form of paralysis. By the time a pattern is obvious, it has already been absorbed by price. Advantage exists in the uncomfortable space between suspicion and confirmation. This space feels dangerous. It demands discipline. It offers no reassurance, but it is where leverage lives. The Enigma story reminds us that systems do not fail because they are flawed. They fail because belief outruns testing, because complexity becomes dogma, because early warnings are dismissed as noise. Those who survive learn to listen differently. They listen for strain, for repetition under stress, for behaviors that emerge not when conditions are ideal, but when they are constrained. They study how people adapt when rules become burdensome, because adaptation leaves tracks. The first crack in the machine was not mechanical, it was psychological. It appeared the moment belief replaced vigilance, the moment complexity was trusted instead of challenged. From that moment on, the outcome was delayed but inevitable. History prefers to crown the final victor, but structure remembers the first fracture. And those who learn to recognize fractures early do not need to be heroes. They need only to be prepared. There is a form of power so counterintuitive that most people refuse to believe it exists. The power to know and not act. When Enigma began to yield its secrets consistently, the Allies did not celebrate. They recoiled, because knowledge, once reliable, became dangerous, not to the enemy, but to the advantage itself. Every decoded message was a temptation. Every revealed ambush invited intervention, and every intervention risked exposure. This was the moment where intelligence transformed into strategy. Inside quiet rooms, far from the front lines, a new rule emerged. Knowing something did not grant permission to change it. Information would be used selectively, asymmetrically, and often withheld entirely. This restraint felt unnatural to military minds trained on decisive action, but it was necessary. If a convoy was saved too often, suspicion would arise. If submarines were intercepted too precisely, patterns would be noticed. If victories clustered unnaturally, the Germans would question the machine they trusted, so silence became policy. Entire ships were allowed to sink even when their fate was known in advance. Air raids were permitted to proceed. Lives were sacrificed not because they were unimportant, but because the secret was more important than any single outcome. Victory was no longer a series of battles. It was a long deception. This is one of the most difficult ideas for the human mind to accept. That sometimes the optimal action is restraint, that the correct move is to endure loss in service of a larger structure. That power is not the ability to intervene everywhere, but the discipline to intervene only where it compounds. Those who worked inside this system carried a burden that history rarely acknowledges. They lived with knowledge that could not be shared. They watched preventable tragedies unfold in silence. They bore responsibility without recognition. And yet, this silence shortened the war. The philosophical law here is stark. Revealing advantage destroys advantage. Power that displays itself invites resistance. Power that remains invisible reshapes outcomes without opposition. This is true in war, in politics, and in markets. Most people believe that if they possess insight, they must act immediately. This impulse is emotional, not strategic. It arises from the need to feel effective, to relieve tension, to convert knowledge into movement. But systems do not reward immediacy, they reward timing. At Bletchley Park, timing was everything. Intelligence was stockpiled like ammunition, deployed only when the risk of exposure was outweighed by strategic necessity. The goal was not to win every encounter, it was to maintain the illusion that the enemy was still safe. Illusion, here, was not deception for its own sake, it was structural preservation. The Germans continued to trust Enigma because the world around them still behaved as expected. Losses occurred, but not too many. Failures happened, but not too cleanly. Reality remained noisy enough to mask the truth. This balance required constant discipline. Too little action and knowledge was wasted. Too much action and the secret was burned. The art lay in navigating this narrow corridor, where advantage could be used without being revealed. This art has a direct parallel in finance. Investors who act on every insight quickly find that their insight degrades. Strategies that are overused become crowded. Trades that are publicized lose edge. Alpha is fragile. It survives only when protected by discretion. Those who understand this do not rush to exploit every opportunity, they choose carefully. They accept missed gains as the cost of staying invisible. They prioritize longevity over short-term validation. This is why the most durable fortunes are often the least visible. They are built slowly, quietly, without signaling intent. They do not announce strategies. They do not require constant activity. They allow compounding to operate without interruption. The Allies learned this lesson under extreme pressure. They learned that information is not power until it is managed properly, that knowing everything does not mean doing everything, that silence, when chosen deliberately, can decide the outcome of history. This chapter of the war was not fought with machines or code, it was fought with restraint, and restraint, paradoxically, proved to be the most aggressive strategy of all. Silence is not emptiness, it is pressure held in reserve. As the war progressed, those entrusted with Enigma intelligence learned that restraint is not passive, it is an active discipline, one that requires constant recalibration. Every decision was weighed not only against immediate outcomes, but against the long arc of belief. What will the enemy conclude if this happens? What pattern will they infer? What story will they tell themselves to remain comfortable? Because comfort, when preserved, becomes a weapon. The German command needed to believe that Enigma still worked, not perfectly, but well enough. They needed explanations for losses that did not threaten the machine's legitimacy, weather, chance, enemy patrols, human error elsewhere. As long as these explanations remained plausible, the system remained intact. So the Allies fed the noise. They acted clumsily on purpose. They delayed responses. They allowed coincidences to accumulate. Intelligence was diluted before use, disguised inside ordinary mistakes. This was not incompetence, it was choreography. A system that expects randomness can be fooled by randomness. Those inside the intelligence apparatus began to think less like soldiers and more like custodians of illusion. Their task was no longer to win decisively, but to maintain ambiguity, to ensure that nothing looked too clean, too efficient, too intelligent. This demanded a level of emotional control that few environments ever require. Knowing something terrible will happen and choosing not to stop it leaves a residue. It changes how you see the world. It teaches you that morality and strategy do not always align neatly, that outcomes must sometimes be traded for structures, that preventing one tragedy might cause a greater one. This is why most people are unfit for long-term advantage. They want immediate resolution. They want to feel useful. They want their knowledge to relieve discomfort right now. But systems of power do not reward those impulses. They reward patience that borders on cruelty. The silence at Bletchley Park was not indifference. It was calculation. And this calculation exposes a philosophical law that rarely enters polite conversation. Truth is not inherently good, it is contextual. When truth is revealed without timing, it destroys itself. When advantage is exercised without restraint, it invites retaliation. When insight is displayed without camouflage, it is neutralized. This is why wisdom has always been associated with quiet, not because wisdom lacks strength, but because it understands the cost of exposure. In markets, this principle is violated daily. Investors broadcast ideas, funds advertise strategies, analysts publish models that work only as long as no one copies them. The moment attention arrives, returns decay. The edge dissolves into the crowd, and then confusion sets in. People ask why something that worked suddenly stopped working. They blame markets, they blame randomness, they blame timing. Rarely do they blame visibility. But visibility is often the culprit. The Enigma advantage survived because it was protected by silence, because it was not flaunted, because it was rationed, because those who held it understood that power, once seen, becomes a target. This is the difference between intelligence and wisdom. Intelligence gathers information, wisdom governs its use. The Allied command did not lack intelligence. They mastered wisdom under pressure. They learned that restraint compounds, that patience preserves leverage, that sometimes the most strategic move is to do nothing and let the system continue revealing itself. Every additional day Enigma remained trusted was another day the Allies could listen, another day they could map the enemy's intentions, another day they could shape outcomes quietly. The Germans never suspected the truth because nothing forced them to. The world still looked chaotic, losses still felt random, reality still conformed to expectation. This is the ultimate camouflage. Not hiding truth, but surrounding it with enough noise that it cannot be isolated. The silence that saved the war was not absence of action. It was mastery of timing. It was the discipline to wait while others acted. It was the courage to endure short-term loss for long-term inevitability. And this discipline, once learned, does not remain confined to war. It appears wherever systems reward longevity over speed, wherever compounding outperforms brilliance, wherever restraint beats reaction. Those who internalize this law stop asking what they can do next. They begin asking what they must not do yet. That shift changes everything. Eventually, silence reshapes the one who practices it. Those who lived inside the long restraint of Enigma intelligence began to see the world differently. They learned that not all losses are failures, and not all victories are visible. They learned that power is not measured by how often it is used, but by how long it can be preserved without detection. This realization is uncomfortable because it contradicts instinct. Human instinct seeks release. When tension builds, we act. When insight arrives, we speak. When advantage appears, we deploy it. Silence feels like waste. Inaction feels like weakness. Yet the Enigma War taught the opposite lesson. Silence, when chosen deliberately, multiplies force. Every day the Allies refrained from acting too precisely, Enigma continued to operate. Every day it operated, it generated more information, and every message sent under the illusion of safety fed the very machine that would eventually destroy that safety. The Germans were not defeated by a single revelation, they were defeated by continuity. This is the hidden architecture of long-term dominance. Short-term thinkers seek decisive moments. Long-term thinkers construct environments where decisive moments become unnecessary. The Allies did not need to win every battle. They needed to ensure the war's trajectory bent quietly and irreversibly in their favor. This bending happened below perception. To the outside world, the war still looked chaotic. Losses appeared random. Victories seemed hard-fought. No clear pattern suggested omniscience. And that was precisely the point. Pattern had to exist without being visible. This is the highest form of control. Not to impose order openly, but to allow others to believe disorder still governs events while outcomes slowly align with intention. Markets operate under the same law. The most successful strategies do not dominate headlines. They do not create dramatic short-term results. They operate beneath narrative thresholds. They allow randomness to exist on the surface, while structure asserts itself underneath. This is why patience is not merely a virtue, it is a weapon. Those who cannot wait expose themselves. They act too early, they reveal their hand, they teach the system how to counter them, and once a system learns your behavior, your advantage disappears. The Germans lost Enigma not because the machine failed mechanically, but because their behavior stabilized around a false belief. They believed they were safe, and safety breeds routine. Routine breeds predictability. Predictability breeds vulnerability. The Allies exploited this chain not by breaking it publicly, but by allowing it to strengthen. The more the Germans trusted Enigma, the more rigid their behavior became. The more rigid their behavior became, the easier it was to anticipate. Silence did not delay victory, it accelerated inevitability. This is the philosophical core of restraint. You do not rush the collapse of a flawed system. You let it reveal itself fully. You allow belief to harden. You wait until the cost of change becomes unbearable. And then, when intervention finally arrives, it feels sudden, overwhelming, and irreversible. From the inside, it feels like fate. From the outside, it is architecture. In finance, this is why the most dangerous environments are not volatile ones. They are stable ones. Long periods of calm allow bad assumptions to crystallize. Risk is mispriced. Behavior synchronizes. When disruption arrives, it arrives everywhere at once. Those who acted early are not heroes, they are often forgotten. Those who waited too long are casualties. Those who understood silence positioned themselves so that when the system broke, they did not need to act aggressively, the system acted for them. This is the final lesson of Enigma's silence. The goal is not to predict collapse, it is to be structurally prepared for it, to build positions that do not require constant adjustment, to allow time, pressure, and human behavior to do the heavy lifting. Silence gives time room to work. Those who fill silence with action often interrupt compounding. Those who respect silence allow compounding to deepen. The Allies respected silence until the very end, and when the war finally concluded, the victory appeared sudden, decisive, overwhelming. But it had been forming quietly for years, just like real advantage always does. If silence is power, then noise is its most reliable enemy. During the war, bombs did not fall first, words did. Leaflets drifted from the sky, radio waves hummed endlessly, newspapers shouted certainty in bold ink. Before cities burned, minds were softened, confused, exhausted. This was not an accident, it was design. Noise was weaponized long before it was understood. Every major power involved in the conflict learned quickly that controlling information did not require truth. It required volume, contradiction, speed. If enough messages competed for attention, discernment collapsed. People stopped asking what was true and settled instead for what felt familiar. The goal was not persuasion, it was saturation. In Germany, propaganda was not merely a tool of morale, it was a shield against doubt. Repetition created rhythm, rhythm created comfort, comfort anesthetized skepticism. When information flows in a single direction long enough, resistance begins to feel irrational, even immoral. The Allies were not innocent of this tactic, they refined it. False broadcasts were injected into enemy channels. Rumors were seeded deliberately, partial truths were mixed with outright fabrications. The purpose was never to convince everyone of one story, it was to ensure that no clear story could dominate. Confusion is easier to manage than belief. When people are overwhelmed, they stop thinking strategically, they react emotionally. Fear and hope oscillate rapidly, attention fragments, memory shortens. In this state, populations become predictable. This is the true function of noise. Not to hide truth completely, but to make the effort of finding it feel unbearable. At Bletchley Park, this principle was observed with clinical clarity. The codebreakers understood that Enigma alone did not protect German communications. Noise did. As long as the informational environment remained chaotic, no single failure would stand out. Losses could be explained away, patterns could be denied. Noise preserved belief. This realization extended beyond cryptography. It reshaped how intelligence itself was deployed. Sometimes the most effective move was not to reveal a secret, but to bury it under a flood of irrelevant facts. Sometimes clarity had to be delayed, diluted, or disguised. Truth, when isolated, is fragile. Truth, when submerged, can survive indefinitely. This is uncomfortable to acknowledge because it contradicts a deeply held ideal. That truth, once spoken, triumphs on its own merit. History suggests otherwise. Truth requires conditions. Without them, it is drowned by louder lies. The war demonstrated this brutally. Civilians did not lack information. They were drowning in it, conflicting reports, official statements, eyewitness accounts, rumors. By the time the truth emerged, attention had already moved on. Fatigue replaced curiosity. Noise does not eliminate truth. It exhausts the search for it. This dynamic did not end with the war. It was perfected. In the modern world, noise is no longer centralized. It is decentralized, automated, continuous. Markets operate under a similar barrage. News alerts, opinions, analysis, predictions. Every movement explained instantly, often contradictorily. Every outcome framed as inevitable in hindsight. The effect is the same. Investors are not uninformed. They are overstimulated. They mistake activity for insight. They chase explanations rather than structures. And in doing so, they surrender their ability to see. Noise creates urgency. Urgency creates reaction. Reaction creates predictability. Those who manufacture noise understand this well. During the war, propaganda units did not need to be accurate. They needed to be consistent, loud enough, repetitive enough, emotionally charged enough to drown out quieter signals. The goal was never to convince the careful thinker, it was to exhaust them. In markets, the merchants of noise operate similarly. They do not need you to believe them, they need you to act, to trade, to switch strategies, to chase, to flee, to remain emotionally engaged. Every click, every transaction, every moment of attention feeds the system. Stillness starves it. The Enigma advantage survived because it was protected from noise. It was not debated publicly. It was not explained. It was not diluted by commentary. It existed in a controlled environment where attention was scarce and intention was disciplined. This contrast reveals the financial lesson with painful clarity. If you allow noise to dictate your actions, you become part of someone else's system. Your behavior becomes predictable. Your decisions become reactive. Your outcomes converge with the crowd. But if you learn to withdraw attention deliberately, clarity returns. Not immediately. At first, silence feels uncomfortable. Boredom surfaces. Anxiety whispers that you are missing something important. This is withdrawal. It passes. On the other side of noise lies structure. Patterns become visible, repetition emerges. What once felt random begins to rhyme, and slowly, without drama, signal separates itself from the flood. This is not a talent, it is a discipline. The war was won not only by breaking codes, but by understanding how noise protects systems from scrutiny. Those who mastered this dynamic shaped outcomes without being seen, and those who ignored it drowned in information while believing they were informed. Noise does not arrive by accident, it is engineered with care. During the war, intelligence officers learned that a single false message was weak, but 1,000 conflicting messages were unstoppable. When truth appears alongside endless distortion, the human mind does not select the correct option. It disengages. It retreats to whatever feels safest. Familiar voices, repeated phrases, emotional alignment. This retreat is the real victory of noise. Propaganda units understood that the goal was not to convince skeptics, but to fatigue them. When people are tired, they do not evaluate. They comply. They follow rhythm instead of reason. They repeat what they have heard most often, not what they have examined most carefully. Repetition replaces truth. In Germany, this repetition created an environment where questioning felt dangerous and unnecessary. In Allied countries, it created an environment where urgency justified contradiction. Both sides flooded the informational field until clarity felt like a luxury. Clarity requires stillness. Noise destroys stillness. Those who worked with Enigma intelligence saw this principle reflected in code itself. A message buried among thousands attracts no special attention. A single anomaly stands out only when the surrounding field is quiet. Noise acts as camouflage by overwhelming comparison. This is why silence was protected so fiercely at Bletchley Park, not only to guard secrets, but to preserve cognitive integrity. Minds that live inside noise lose the ability to distinguish relevance. They mistake motion for meaning. This cognitive erosion is subtle. At first, people feel informed. They consume more. They read more. They listen more. They react faster. But over time, their decisions become less coherent. Their confidence rises as accuracy falls. They develop opinions that feel urgent, but collapse under pressure. This is not stupidity, it is overload. The human brain evolved to detect patterns in sparse environments. When inputs exceed processing capacity, the brain shifts from analysis to heuristics. It relies on shortcuts, authority, popularity, emotional cues. These shortcuts feel efficient, but they are predictable. Predictability is exploitable. During the war, noise created obedience. In markets, it creates liquidity. Traders who are constantly reacting provide the volume that allows larger systems to operate quietly. Every emotional decision becomes someone else's structural advantage. Noise keeps participants active but unaligned, busy but ineffective. This is why silence is resisted so strongly. Silence removes stimulation. It exposes uncertainty. It forces confrontation with ignorance. Many prefer noise to this discomfort. They would rather feel busy than admit they do not know. The merchants of noise understand this instinctively. They sell reassurance disguised as urgency. They provide explanations immediately, even when explanation is impossible. They frame randomness as narrative to soothe anxiety. The price of this comfort is accuracy. Markets do not reward those who feel informed. They reward those who are positioned correctly, and positioning requires patience, not stimulation. The Enigma operators lived inside noise of their own creation. Messages flowed constantly, reports accumulated, complexity reassured them. They believed that if something were wrong, it would be obvious. They did not realize that obviousness is precisely what noise prevents. The same illusion governs modern financial systems. When everything is explained, nothing is understood. When every movement has a narrative, no structure is examined. When attention is fragmented, no pattern is completed. This is why true signal often feels boring. It repeats, it persists, it lacks drama, it does not demand action, it invites observation. Noise, by contrast, demands immediate response. It flatters emotion. It rewards impulsivity with the illusion of participation. Those who break free from noise experience a period of discomfort. They feel detached, out of sync, late. This is the cost of independence. But slowly, another sensation emerges. Clarity, not certainty. Clarity of structure. The ability to see what repeats across time. The ability to recognize when nothing needs to be done. The ability to wait without anxiety. This is the state in which advantage becomes visible. The war revealed that noise protects systems from being understood. Markets confirm it daily. Those who wish to survive must learn not only how to analyze, but how to withdraw. Silence is not absence of information, it is the removal of distraction. And in that removal, truth regains its shape. There is a final deception hidden inside noise, and it is the most dangerous one. Noise convinces people that they are participating. During the war, populations believed they were informed because they were constantly addressed. Bulletins arrived daily, speeches filled the air, explanations accompanied every loss. People felt involved, even empowered, because they were never left in silence. In reality, they were being managed. Their reactions were anticipated, their emotions were guided, their agency was softened. Noise does not silence people, it keeps them busy. Those who truly understood the war operated differently. They spoke less. They listened more. They allowed long stretches of ambiguity to exist without filling them with reassurance. They understood that filling silence is an act of control. This understanding shaped the Allied intelligence posture profoundly. The most sensitive knowledge was not only hidden from enemies, but from allies, from politicians, even from commanders who might misuse it. The fewer minds involved, the lower the entropy. The lower the entropy, the clearer the signal. Noise was the enemy of intelligence, not ignorance. This is why secrecy feels uncomfortable to democratic societies. Silence feels undemocratic. It feels exclusionary. It feels like weakness. Yet in environments where outcomes depend on structure rather than opinion, silence becomes a form of protection. The Enigma advantage survived because it was isolated from commentary. No debates, no public analysis, no competing interpretations. Just disciplined listening and selective action. This isolation allowed patterns to accumulate without distortion. It allowed intelligence to mature before being exposed. The contrast with modern markets is striking. Today, nothing is allowed to mature. Every idea is discussed immediately. Every observation is shared. Every strategy is dissected in public. This creates the illusion of collective intelligence while destroying individual edge. When everyone knows something, it is no longer knowledge, it is consensus. And consensus is where returns go to die. The merchants of noise thrive on this dynamic. They monetize attention, not accuracy. They benefit when you feel compelled to react, not when you feel compelled to wait. Their business model depends on movement. Your clarity is irrelevant to them. This is not malice, it is structure. Markets require liquidity. Liquidity requires participation. Participation requires stimulation. Noise is the cheapest form of stimulation ever invented. Those who step out of noise disrupt this chain. They reduce their predictability. They become difficult to model. They stop feeding systems designed to extract value from impulsivity. This is why silence feels rebellious. Not loud rebellion, quiet refusal. Refusal to comment immediately. Refusal to trade constantly. Refusal to have an opinion on everything. Refusal to mistake engagement for intelligence. During the war, silence was enforced by necessity. In markets, it must be chosen deliberately, and choice is harder than enforcement, because silence offers no immediate reward. It offers no social validation. It offers no sense of urgency. It demands trust in process and comfort with boredom. It requires the discipline to sit with uncertainty without resolving it prematurely. Most people cannot tolerate this. They fill gaps with action, they fill stillness with noise, and in doing so, they surrender the very advantage they seek. The Enigma story closes this chapter with a simple truth. The loudest environments hide the most predictable behavior. The quietest observers extract the most durable advantage. Noise did not protect Enigma forever. It delayed recognition. It bought time. But once silence was mastered on the other side, the machine's fate was sealed. In finance, noise performs the same function. It delays understanding, it buys time for those who already see structure, and it extracts value from those who cannot stop reacting. The lesson is not to escape noise completely, that is impossible. The lesson is to ration attention, to decide deliberately when to listen and when to withdraw, to understand that not every movement deserves interpretation, that not every explanation deserves belief, that not every opportunity requires action. Those who learn this do not feel smarter, they feel calmer. And calm, in systems governed by human behavior, is a rare and powerful advantage. After the war, the noise did not disappear, it multiplied. The machines fell silent, the radios changed tone, the flags were folded away, but the underlying problem remained. Information now flowed faster than ever before, freed from censorship, accelerated by technology, and celebrated as progress. The world believed it had entered an age of clarity. In reality, it had entered an age of saturation. This was the moment when a quiet idea became unavoidable. Not all information carries meaning. Claude Shannon did not arrive with a manifesto or a moral vision. He arrived with a question that felt almost offensive in its simplicity. How much information is actually being transmitted, and how much of it is noise? Not what does it say, but what survives distortion. This question reframed everything. Until then, communication was treated as an art, a matter of language, intention, and interpretation. Shannon treated it as structure. Signals passed through channels. Channels introduced interference. Interference reduced reliability. Meaning, therefore, was not guaranteed by volume, but by resistance to entropy. Entropy is not chaos, it is uncertainty. This distinction matters. Chaos feels dramatic. Entropy is quiet. It accumulates unnoticed, degrading systems gradually rather than destroying them suddenly. Messages become ambiguous. Signals weaken. Decisions become harder to justify. Confidence increases as clarity decreases. Shannon's insight was ruthless. More data does not reduce uncertainty, often it increases it. A message buried in noise is not improved by adding more words. It is improved by reducing distortion. Clarity is not created by expansion, it is created by constraint. This idea arrived at the precise moment the world needed it and immediately ignored it. Post-war society celebrated abundance, more communication, more choice, more speed, more connection. Few wanted to hear that meaning required limits. That understanding demanded reduction. That truth might be quieter than lies. But systems listened, even if people did not. Engineers applied Shannon's work to build reliable communication in hostile environments. Satellites, telephones, early computers. Everywhere interference existed, structure was imposed. Redundancy was introduced not to add information, but to preserve it. Noise was anticipated, not denied. Meaning was engineered. This is the philosophical pivot. Truth does not survive because it is correct. It survives because it is structured to endure distortion. During the war, Enigma messages survived because they were protected by complexity. Allied intelligence survived because it was protected by silence. After the war, meaning itself required protection from overload. This requirement exposes a deep misunderstanding about knowledge. People assume that understanding grows linearly with information, that more inputs lead to better decisions, that if you just read enough, listen enough, analyze enough, clarity will emerge. Shannon demonstrated the opposite. Beyond a certain point, additional information degrades signal, attention fragments, correlations blur, noise overwhelms capacity, the mind stops processing and starts reacting. This is not a failure of intelligence, it is a law of systems. Every channel has a capacity. Exceed it, and information becomes self-defeating. This law governs markets with brutal consistency. Financial participants consume endless data, earnings, macroeconomics, commentary, social sentiment, technical indicators. Each piece feels informative in isolation. Together, they exceed cognitive bandwidth. Decisions become inconsistent, conviction weakens, timing deteriorates. The irony is cruel. The more informed people feel, the worse their outcomes often become. Because what they are consuming is not signal, it is entropy. Markets reward those who understand channel capacity, those who know how much information they can process reliably and refuse to exceed it, those who build narrow filters rather than wide nets. This is why great investors are selective, not omnivorous. They do not follow everything. They follow a few things deeply. They design their information environment the way engineers design communication systems, reducing interference, limiting inputs, preserving clarity. Shannon's mathematics reveals a truth that feels almost spiritual. Meaning is not discovered, it is protected. Protected from noise, protected from distortion, protected from the temptation to add when subtraction is required. During the war, intelligence failed when messages were intercepted too late. After the war, intelligence fails when signals are drowned too early. The discipline is the same. You must decide what to ignore. Ignoring is not ignorance, it is strategy. Every system that survives hostile conditions does so by narrowing its channel. Every mind that sees clearly in a noisy world does the same. Entropy is always increasing, noise is always expanding. This cannot be stopped, but meaning can still be preserved. Not by consuming more, by choosing less. Once entropy is understood, responsibility shifts. You can no longer claim confusion as fate. You can no longer blame complexity for paralysis. If uncertainty grows when inputs exceed capacity, then clarity becomes an act of design, not discovery. After the war, this realization quietly reshaped the world. Communication systems stopped pretending that noise was an anomaly. They assumed it. Static, interference, loss, distortion were no longer errors to be eliminated, but conditions to be engineered around. Redundancy was introduced not to add content, but to preserve meaning. Constraints were imposed not to limit freedom, but to make freedom usable. This is a lesson most individuals never apply to their own thinking. They treat their minds like open channels, allowing every signal to pass through. News, opinions, alerts, forecasts, outrage, hope, fear. The result is not insight, but saturation. Decisions become fragile. Convictions evaporate under pressure. Reaction replaces judgment. Entropy wins quietly. Shannon's work implies something deeply unsettling for the modern world. Truth does not scale naturally. As volume increases, meaning degrades unless structure intervenes. This means that in environments flooded with information, the default outcome is confusion, not enlightenment. This is not because people are foolish. It is because channels have limits. Markets are perfect demonstrations of this law. Prices move as compressed information. They reflect not truth, but consensus under constraint. When too many narratives compete, price becomes erratic. Volatility increases not because reality is changing faster, but because interpretation is fragmenting. Investors respond by consuming more information, hoping to regain control. This accelerates the problem. Entropy rises, signal weakens, confidence decays. The solution feels counterintuitive. Less input, stronger filters, narrower focus. Great decision makers do not try to know everything. They try to know a few things with exceptional clarity. They define their channels deliberately. They choose which signals are allowed to pass and which are blocked entirely. This is not ignorance. It is architecture. During the war, intelligence failed when it arrived too late. In markets, intelligence fails when it arrives too diluted. The difference between insight and noise is not the content itself, but its placement within a system designed to preserve meaning. Entropy also reveals why explanation is not the same as understanding. Explanations multiply as systems fail. After every crisis, narratives bloom. Analysts explain why it was obvious. Commentators assign blame. These explanations feel satisfying, but they do not reduce entropy. They increase it by adding more stories to an already saturated field. Understanding, by contrast, simplifies. It reduces variables. It identifies constraints. It asks which factors actually move outcomes and which merely decorate them. It accepts that most information is irrelevant to decision-making and discards it without regret. This discipline feels uncomfortable because it requires saying no constantly. No to updates, no to commentary, no to constant engagement, no to the illusion that being informed is the same as being prepared. Preparedness comes from structure. Shannon's mathematics teaches that reliability emerges from repetition and constraint, not novelty. A signal repeated clearly through a narrow channel survives noise better than a complex message broadcast widely. In finance, this translates into principles that feel almost ascetic. Define a small number of variables that matter. Observe them consistently. Accept long periods where nothing changes. Resist the urge to intervene simply because attention demands activity. This is how meaning survives entropy. The world will continue to produce noise at increasing speed. Technology ensures this. Platforms profit from it. Systems depend on it. You cannot escape it entirely, but you can choose how much of it you allow inside your decision-making process. Clarity is not about being ahead of the news. It is about being aligned with structure, about knowing which signals persist across time and which dissolve quickly. Entropy punishes those who chase immediacy. It rewards those who respect capacity. The war taught this lesson under conditions of survival. Markets teach it under conditions of temptation. Both are unforgiving. Entropy never announces itself. It drifts in quietly, disguised as abundance. After the war, societies celebrated the flood. More communication, more connection, more access, more voices. It felt like liberation, and for a time, it was. But entropy does not care about intention. It accumulates regardless of hope. Meaning began to thin. People noticed it without naming it. Decisions felt harder. Certainty felt fragile. Conviction dissolved quickly under pressure. The world seemed louder, faster, yet strangely less comprehensible. Explanations multiplied, but understanding did not follow. This is the lived experience of entropy. When channels exceed capacity, the mind stops building models and starts reacting to stimuli. Attention jumps, memory shortens, context collapses. Choices feel urgent but shallow. In this state, people do not make decisions. They express moods. Systems learn to exploit this. Markets thrive on mood. Volatility feeds participation. Participation feeds liquidity. Liquidity feeds scale. The system does not require clarity from individuals. It requires activity. Noise is not a side effect. It is fuel. Those who recognize this step away from the stream, not because they believe themselves superior, but because they understand physics. A signal cannot survive unlimited interference. This is why the most valuable knowledge often feels sparse. It is not impressive. It does not explain everything. It focuses on a few forces that repeat relentlessly over time. It is built to endure distortion. During the war, intelligence officers learned to distrust elegant explanations. They preferred crude patterns that held under pressure. They learned that a simple rule, repeated reliably, outperformed a sophisticated theory that required perfect conditions. Entropy destroys sophistication first. This is why crises expose truth. Under stress, systems revert to their simplest behaviors. Correlations converge, incentives dominate. People choose survival over ideals. The stories collapse, leaving structure exposed. Those who prepared for this do not feel surprised, they feel confirmed. In finance, this manifests brutally. Strategies that rely on precise timing, perfect liquidity, or continuous optimism fail first. Strategies built on margin of safety, patience, and structural advantage endure. The difference is not intelligence, it is respect for entropy. Most people attempt to fight entropy by adding more information, more models, more updates, more certainty. This is like trying to stop erosion by pouring water onto a cliff. The counterintuitive solution is subtraction. Reduce inputs, narrow focus, limit exposure, repeat what matters, ignore what does not. This is not withdrawal from reality, it is alignment with it. Meaning does not survive by expansion, it survives by compression. Markets reward those who compress reality into durable rules. Those who understand that a small number of forces drive most outcomes. Those who are willing to be bored while others are stimulated. Boredom is not the absence of opportunity, it is the absence of noise. Those who tolerate boredom gain access to longer time horizons. They see cycles complete, they watch behaviors repeat, they recognize when nothing has changed despite constant movement. This perspective is impossible inside entropy. The Enigma War was won because intelligence was compressed, signals were protected, noise was managed, meaning was preserved long enough to act decisively. Modern markets operate under the opposite pressure. They flood participants with more data than can be processed. They reward reaction. They punish stillness socially, even as they reward it structurally. The discipline required now is internal. To design your own channel, to decide what enters and what is blocked, to accept that you will miss things, to accept that missing things is the price of clarity. Those who refuse this price pay a higher one. Confusion, inconsistency, regret. Entropy cannot be defeated, it can only be managed. The mathematics of meaning teaches this quietly, without ideology or promise. It offers no shortcuts, only structure. And structure, once built, does not need constant attention. It simply holds. When the war ended, the machines did not disappear, they changed uniforms. The rooms once filled with humming rotors and guarded silence gave way to laboratories, universities, and newly formed intelligence agencies. The same minds that had learned to listen to chaos were quietly reassigned to new problems. The enemy was no longer a nation, it was uncertainty itself. Many of the wartime codebreakers did not return to ordinary life. Ordinary life had become too loud, too imprecise. They had spent years training their attention to notice what repeated under pressure. That skill did not fade when the guns fell silent. It searched for new terrain. It found it in data. The Cold War did not erupt with explosions at first. It unfolded as a contest of prediction, missile trajectories, supply chains, economic capacity, signals intelligence. Everything depended on interpreting incomplete information faster and more accurately than the other side. Once again, pattern mattered more than narrative. Governments began to realize that the future would not be decided by ideology alone, but by those who could detect trends before they became visible. Analysts who had once broken ciphers were now asked to model economies, to forecast shortages, to anticipate reactions rather than events. This transition felt natural to those who had lived inside Enigma. They were already trained to distrust surface explanations. They knew that what mattered was not what people said, but what systems forced them to do. Behavior under constraint revealed more than intention. Out of this mindset emerged a new figure, not a soldier, not a politician, a pattern seer. These individuals did not predict specific outcomes. They studied distributions. They watched for drift. They noted how small imbalances accumulated into irreversible momentum. They understood that large events are rarely sudden. They are slow until they are not. This way of thinking began to migrate quietly into civilian domains. Universities absorbed it first. Mathematics, statistics, and early computer science converged around the idea that complex systems could be modeled probabilistically. Certainty was replaced by likelihood, explanation by estimation. The future became something to be bounded rather than known. Industry followed. Corporations began to collect data not to understand customers, but to anticipate them. Patterns of behavior were more valuable than individual preferences. A person could lie, a distribution could not. And then finance noticed. Markets, long treated as emotional theaters, began to be reframed as systems of signals and noise. Price was no longer merely a reflection of value. It became information compressed into movement. Volatility became a message. Correlation became a clue. Those who approached markets with the mindset of a codebreaker saw something others did not. They saw repetition where others saw randomness. They saw constraints where others saw chaos. They saw that human behavior, when aggregated, followed rules even when individuals felt free. This was unsettling. Traditional finance relied on stories, growth narratives, leadership charisma, economic optimism. These stories worked when conditions were stable, but under stress, they collapsed. The pattern thinkers were not surprised. They had seen this before. During the war, generals trusted plans, codebreakers trusted behavior. In markets, speculators trusted stories, pattern seers trusted structure. This distinction created a quiet divergence. Those who listened for signal built systems that did not require constant decision-making. They defined rules. They limited discretion. They allowed probabilities to play out over time. Losses were expected. Variance was accepted. Survival was prioritized. Those who chased narrative felt constantly engaged, constantly informed, constantly late. The pattern seers were not louder, they were not faster, they were not more visible, they were simply aligned with how systems actually behave. This alignment did not make them heroes, it made them durable. The transition from code-breaking to pattern recognition was not a leap, it was a continuation. The same law applied. Complex systems leak information through repetition. Noise disguises structure. Silence reveals it. The war taught this under threat of annihilation. Markets teach it under threat of temptation. The question is not whether patterns exist. The question is whether you are trained to notice them before belief gets in the way. What separated the pattern seers from everyone else was not intelligence, but temperament. They were not impatient with uncertainty, they were at home in it. Those who came from wartime intelligence had spent years working without feedback, without recognition, without certainty that their efforts even mattered. They learned to operate without emotional reinforcement. This rewired their relationship with time. Time was no longer an enemy to defeat, it was an ally to cooperate with. In markets, this made them almost unnerving to observe. While others reacted to headlines, they watched how prices behaved after the headlines were forgotten. While others argued about meaning, they measured response. While others searched for explanations, they tracked repetition. They understood something that most never do. Markets do not reward being right, they reward being aligned. Aligned with incentives, aligned with flows, aligned with human weakness, repeated at scale. The codebreakers had learned that people under pressure revert to habit. The pattern seers applied the same logic to capital. Fear, forced selling. Greed, forced leverage. Career risk, forced conformity. These behaviors repeated with mechanical reliability, regardless of era, asset class, or technology. Technology did not eliminate human behavior, it amplified it. Computers accelerated execution, but they did not change motivation. Faster markets did not become wiser. They became more emotional, more fragile, more prone to cascading error. Noise increased, entropy deepened. This created an environment where the old lessons became even more valuable. The pattern seers did not attempt to compete with speed. They competed with positioning. They placed themselves where time worked for them rather than against them. They accepted small losses without reaction. They waited for moments when structure and behavior aligned. These moments were rare. That was the point. Scarcity of action preserved clarity. This discipline looked like inaction to outsiders. Critics called it cautious, old-fashioned, out of touch. The same words had once been used to describe the analysts who sat quietly at Bletchley Park while others demanded action. History repeated itself. The crowd mistook restraint for ignorance. They mistook silence for absence. They mistook patience for fear. And once again, they were wrong. The pattern seers did not try to outthink the market, they tried to outlast it. They built systems that assumed mistakes. They allowed drawdowns. They did not require perfect foresight. Their strength lay in asymmetry, small, controlled losses paired with rare but decisive gains. This structure is psychologically unbearable for most. It requires faith in process over outcome. It demands the ability to be wrong repeatedly without changing course. It offers no reassurance during long stretches of boredom or underperformance. But when stress arrives, it reveals its power. During crises, when narratives collapse and liquidity vanishes, patterns reassert themselves. Forced behavior becomes visible. Correlations snap into place. The market shows its skeleton. Those who prepared for this moment do not panic, they recognize it. This recognition is calm, not celebratory. It carries no triumph, only confirmation. The codebreakers never celebrated when Enigma messages aligned. They noted it and continued. Pattern seers approach markets the same way. Emotion is treated as noise, reaction as liability. This is why pattern literacy cannot be taught through slogans. It is learned through exposure to uncertainty without relief, through repeated encounters with boredom, through resisting the urge to explain everything. The transition from codebreaker to pattern seer is complete when one internalizes a single truth. Most of what matters happens slowly, and most of what is loud does not matter at all. Markets, like wars, are decided long before the decisive moment becomes visible. Those who understand this do not rush toward the future. They wait for it to arrive, where they already stand. There comes a point where pattern recognition stops feeling like skill and begins to feel like solitude. Those who live this way gradually find themselves misaligned with the tempo of the world. Conversations feel rushed, opinions feel brittle, urgency feels theatrical. The noise that excites others begins to register as static. This is not superiority, it is consequence. To see patterns, you must slow down enough to let them repeat. The pattern seers understood that the market, like Enigma, does not reveal itself through singular events. It reveals itself through recurrence, the same behaviors under different disguises, the same mistakes wearing new language, the same incentives driving different actors toward identical outcomes. This repetition is comforting once recognized. It means the future is not chaotic, it is probabilistic. The crowd experiences markets as a sequence of surprises. Pattern seers experience them as cycles unfolding on schedule, not exact schedules, but rhythmic ones. Expansion followed by excess. Excess followed by fragility. Fragility followed by collapse. Collapse followed by denial. Denial followed by renewal. These phases repeat because human behavior repeats. Technology accelerates the cycle, but it does not alter its structure. New instruments appear, new terminology spreads, new narratives dominate, yet when stress arrives, behavior snaps back to form. This is why the most important skill is not prediction, it is recognition. Recognition that leverage always concentrates, that risk is always underestimated near peaks, that correlation always increases under stress, that liquidity is always assumed until it vanishes. These are not opinions, they are structural truths observed across decades. The pattern seers do not attempt to convince others of these truths. Convincing is unnecessary. Patterns do not require belief to function, they require patience to exploit. This patience isolates. Those who withdraw from noise are often accused of disengagement, of pessimism, of missing opportunities. Yet the accusation reveals misunderstanding. They are not disengaged, they are deeply engaged with structure rather than spectacle. Spectacle is loud because it is fragile. Structure is quiet because it endures. During the war, the loudest victories were often the least important. The quiet rerouting of a convoy mattered more than a celebrated battle. In markets, the same inversion holds. The dramatic trade is rarely the decisive one. The patient positioning is. The pattern seer's reward is not excitement, it is alignment. Alignment between belief and behavior, between process and outcome, between expectation and reality. This alignment creates resilience. When losses occur, they are absorbed. When gains arrive, they are not squandered. Emotion does not override structure, because structure was designed to accommodate emotion. This is the final inheritance of Enigma, not a method, not a machine, a posture. A posture that accepts uncertainty without panic, that respects complexity without worshiping it, that listens longer than it speaks, that waits without anxiety. The world will continue to reward noise with attention. It will continue to confuse motion with progress. It will continue to celebrate speed while punishing haste. Those who choose to live as pattern seers will always appear out of sync, until suddenly they are not. When the system bends, they are already positioned. When narratives collapse, they are already aligned. When others ask what happened, they recognize the moment as inevitable. This is not foresight, it is memory. Memory of how systems behave when belief outruns structure. Memory of how noise masks fragility. Memory of how silence preserves advantage. The journey from codebreaker to pattern seer is complete when you stop needing to be right loudly and start needing to be aligned quietly. At that point, the market stops feeling hostile. It feels legible, and legibility in a noisy world is a rare form of wealth. History does not move forward in straight lines, it spirals. When the world finally spoke Alan Turing's name with reverence, decades had already passed. Apologies were issued, statues were raised, his face appeared on currency. The system corrected itself, slowly, impersonally, long after the cost had been paid. This delay is not a failure of memory, it is a feature of structure. Societies rarely recognize their visionaries while they are alive. Those who see too clearly disrupt existing narratives. They expose assumptions that others rely on for comfort. Recognition arrives only after the disruption has been absorbed, sanitized, and made safe. Truth follows the same path. It is ignored when it is inconvenient, resisted when it threatens belief, accepted only after it no longer demands change. By the time truth is celebrated, its edge has usually passed to someone else. This is why truth feels simple in hindsight. Once noise fades, structure appears obvious. Patterns look inevitable. Outcomes feel predetermined. People ask how it was ever missed. They forget the environment in which it first appeared, the saturation, the disbelief, the cost of seeing early. The Enigma story reveals this dynamic with clarity. The machine was never magical. Its weaknesses were always present. The signals were always there. What changed was the willingness to look without reverence, to question complexity, to endure silence long enough for repetition to emerge. This willingness is rare because it offers no immediate reward. Those who see early must wait. They must endure doubt, isolation, and often ridicule. They must accept being out of sync with the world's tempo, and they must do so without certainty that validation will ever arrive. Most people cannot tolerate this. They prefer to be wrong with the crowd than right alone. They prefer consensus to clarity. They prefer noise to silence. Markets reflect this preference mercilessly. The majority does not lose money because they lack intelligence. They lose money because they lack alignment. They act when the system demands restraint. They chase when structure demands patience. They react when repetition demands waiting. Truth in markets is simple. Human behavior repeats. Incentives matter more than narratives. Complexity hides fragility. Noise exhausts discernment. Silence preserves advantage. These truths are not exciting, they do not promise speed, they do not flatter ego, they offer durability instead. Those who accept them stop asking how to get rich quickly, they start asking how to remain solvent indefinitely. They stop seeking certainty, they build systems that survive uncertainty. This shift changes everything. Wealth becomes a byproduct of alignment rather than effort. Freedom emerges not from domination, but from understanding. Decisions become fewer, slower, and more deliberate. And gradually, without drama, outcomes improve. The world will continue to reward noise with attention. It will continue to celebrate complexity and punish simplicity. It will continue to crown heroes late and forget builders early. This will not change. What can change is where you stand. You can stand inside the noise, reacting endlessly, mistaking motion for progress, or you can step into silence, where patterns repeat, where structure reveals itself, where truth waits patiently for those willing to listen. Truth is simple, but it is never obvious.